Hi, I'm Hailey Hough for the Power of the Patient Project. My guest today is Dr. Joseph Nowinski. He is the author of Recovery After Rehab, a guide for the newly sober and their loved ones. For those who are struggling with addiction, this book provides a helpful guide for finding recovery and is also an excellent resource for loved ones of those dealing with addiction. Long-term recovery is important, and Dr. Nowinski explains how to be successful after rehab. Dr. Nowinski is currently an assistant professor at the Hazelden Betty Ford Graduate School of Addiction Studies. Welcome, Dr. Nowinski.
Oh, pleasure to be here.
So please tell us a little bit about your new book, Recovery After Rehab. Why do you feel this was an important book to write?
Well, most of my career, a lot of my career was devoted to developing treatment programs for substance abusers, for adults and adolescents. And listeners who are interested in that part of my career can go to my website, josephnowinski.com, and take a look at my publications there. And a lot of my work has been focused on treatment, okay, or what you call rehab. But for a long time, it was very apparent to me that that was only a piece of recovery, a beginning, if you will, of recovery. Sometimes people have a tendency to confuse rehab or treatment with a cure. My loved one or my child has a substance use problem. Thank God he's going into treatment, or she's going into treatment, and she'll come back okay. Now, treatment is important. There's no question about that. But I've long been aware that that's not a cure. Right. I think sometimes the tendency to think of rehab as a cure shortchanges recovery to some extent. And so even some of the movement towards harm reduction, I have no problem with harm reduction. But sometimes I think people look at harm reduction because they fail to see rehab or treatment as just the beginning. And so things go bad, and then they think about harm reduction. So there's nothing wrong with harm reduction. It's just that you need to think of it in context. So the reason that I wrote this book was obviously in consultation with my editor, and the idea being that we need to let people know that rehab or treatment is sort of kind of like planting a seedling. You plant a seedling, and it's a good start. You plant the seedling, but that's only the beginning. And that if you want recovery to take root, then what happens afterward is very important, especially say the first year after treatment or rehab. Right. And that's what the book is about. And I also take the position that it's not only the person with the substance abuse problem, but it's their loved ones who are stakeholders in the recovery problem. They're stakeholders too, because not only does addiction affect the substance abuser, but it affects friends, family, it affects their whole life. And those people really are stakeholders in the process, and they shouldn't be excluded. So the book basically takes that approach that it really needs to be a collaborative effort that begins after rehab stops.
Yeah, definitely. And I know that you kind of pointed out that you made sure that within your book you kind of identified that it wasn't necessarily a cure. So it seems like you took the book as an opportunity to kind of tackle some misconceptions perhaps about substance abuse and whatnot. Are there any other misconceptions that you did take an opportunity to kind of tackle and clear up for anybody who doesn't or has not dealt with anything like this?
Yeah, well, I think the book is divided into, it's a very practical book, it's divided into various numbers of issues that not only the newly sober person, but their loved ones need to be aware of. Yeah. And even begins with what happens when they come home from rehab. Sometimes there's some false expectations that everything's going to be okay. Sometimes even the substance abuser who's feeling a lot better because they're maybe sober for the first time in a long time, they come home feeling better. And sometimes they expect everybody to be really happy about that. You're home and everything's great. they're not necessarily aware of just how much anxiety there may be in their loved ones.
Yeah.
You know, their loved ones may be anxious because on some level they're aware of the risk of relapse, so they're cautious. Sometimes there's some negative issues that need to be addressed. For example, children can become very alienated from a parent. You know, I remember one guy told me he came home from rehab and he was feeling on top of the world, and his 12-year-old daughter wasn't even there to greet him when he got home.
Oh,
So there was a lesson there that, you know, don't expect everybody to jump for joy. So, I mean, that's one thing. What happens when you come home? What are you really thinking when you come home from rehab?
right.
Are you really thinking that at this point you need to quit using and drinking because it's gotten you into so much trouble? Or are you in the back of your mind thinking, well, maybe I could use a little bit, or maybe I could use on the weekend? That's important in terms of predicting relapse versus recovery. So people need to look at that. I talk about medication-assisted treatment, which is very popular today, and what role it can play in recovery. And medication-assisted treatment for alcohol or opioid abuse. There are medications like Suboxone and naltrexone that can help. But again, it's important to realize, to understand what the research shows. And the research shows that those things work if you take them. But there's a whole issue of compliance, if you will. And the compliance rate for those medications is pretty similar to any other chronic illness, diabetes, hypertension. The research shows that about only 50% of people stick to what their treatment should be, only 50%. And the same thing happens with substance abuse. So again, the substance abuser and their loved ones need to be aware that, yeah, it can help, but are you committed to taking it? Right. Or are you going to decide that you don't want to take it on Thursday because you think you're going to drink on Saturday? something like that.
Bring the horse to the water, but you can't make him drink it.
That's exactly right. And there's chapters on how you need to change your lifestyle, because staying sober requires changes in your lifestyle that aren't necessarily easy. But if you go back to the same old lifestyle, the same friends, the same places, the same routines, you know, the chances of relapsing are greater. I mean, it could even be as minor, you might think, as, you know, when you get home from work, what clothes do you change into? If you're used to getting into your old flannel shirt and lighting up a joint, then getting home, you probably need to get a different shirt.
Right.
You know, things like that. Or you need to, sometimes it's tough because sometimes you really need to change your friends. And one of the biggest predictors, for example, for adolescent relapse is that they will go to treatment. They may do very well in treatment, but as soon as they get home, the phone rings and it's their old friends, you know, who get high. And that's really tough for a young person. That's really tough for a young person to have to realize that, well, you know, maybe I can't hang out with Rebecca anymore because Rebecca likes to get high.
Right. I mean, yeah, it's way more than just, you know, stopping from, you know, taking a substance. I mean, you're changing your lifestyle. Sometimes, you know, I read this quote and it said, people stay in hell because the street signs are familiar. And I feel like that is applicable here because, I mean, people think that it's as easy as, you know, saying no when feeling the temptation, but a lot of times that becomes their reality. They're surrounded by familiar shirts or their friends, or, you know, how it's everything. It's like you have to totally recreate your surroundings in a way so that you're not facing that sort of temptation. It's a lot more complicated than it seems, I feel like.
Yes, that's absolutely right. I mean, those people who take the position that, oh, you should just say no, I think that they really, really miss the boat. They really underestimate just how much, as substance abuse progresses, a person's lifestyle changes. You know, I've worked with young people, and they will be A students up to, say, 8th grade. Then suddenly their parents will say, starting in 9th and 10th grade, they changed. their personality changed, their friends changed, their activities changed, their whole lifestyle changed. And that's true for adults as well. And
Yeah.
as substance use progresses, it shrinks. Your lifestyle shrinks to be more and more around substance abuse. And so when someone says, "Oh, you should just say no," they misunderstand exactly how much has to change. And again, the newly sober person coming out of treatment or rehab and their loved ones need to understand that there needs to be lifestyle changes. They're not necessarily easy, but if recovery is going to take root, they're really necessary. If you just go back to your same old routines, your same old friends, going to the same old places, just say no, it's not going to work.
Right. Definitely. I agree 100%. So in your book, you discuss recovery from rehab and how often people may relapse. So what are the steps for a long-term recovery from substance abuse exactly?
Well, I think these lifestyle changes, I think addressing healing relationships,
Yeah.
damaged relationships need to be healed, and that often is a painful process too, because people.
I'm so sorry.
Sorry.
My gosh, I am so sorry.
That's okay. So people need to be honest about the fact that relationships need to be healed, lifestyles need to change. Also, there's an issue of possible, mental illness, mental health issues. Substance abuse often coexists with a mental health issue, like an anxiety disorder or depression.
Mm-hmm.
Could be a history of trauma in a person's life. Substance abuse doesn't usually just fall out of thin air. It usually starts because of some kind of some reason.
Right.
And so it can be important to recognize that. It's what I call double trouble. So not only the substance abuse, but if you don't deal with, say, chronic depression that you suffered from for a long time, that depression can be a risk factor for relapse, because a lot of people historically have used drugs or alcohol in order to deal with anxiety or depression. So that's another issue that needs to be kind of brought out into the open. And maybe not only do you need to change your lifestyle, get involved in a fellowship. I talk about the importance of fellowships, but you also may need to go for mental health treatment to deal with that anxiety or depression in order to recover from both. I also talk about fellowships. I think they're really important. Research does show that fellowships, and AA is one, but not just AA. There are others. There's one called Women for Sobriety. There's Smart Recovery. There are even ones for Native Americans called Wellbriety. So there's a whole bunch of them. But what they have in common is that they're fellowships and they're devoted to abstinence, pursuing abstinence as the goal. And research shows that they work. They're very powerful because they help the person change their lifestyle, basically,
right.
and get group support for staying sober. So I also talk about how the role that fellowships can play in sustaining recovery. AA is the most available. It's the most available, and it's the most diverse. If you go online to aa.org, depending on, you live in a city?
Yeah.
So if you go to aa.org in a city, you'll probably find 100 different kinds of meetings. And they're not all the same by any means. You can pick and choose men's, women's, women's meetings, gay meetings, agnostic meetings, all kinds of, here in Connecticut, there's meetings for professionals. So AA is pretty diverse, but it's not the only one. Like I said, there's Women for Sobriety, which is also a fellowship that supports recovery. And it has its own program, sort of like the 12 steps that women follow. And so I talk in the book about the importance of all those things, the lifestyle changes, the possibility of medication for mental illness, changing your thinking, making sure that you're not in the back of your mind thinking, okay, I've been sober for 4 months, so I can smoke some pot now.
Right.
You know?
Definitely. Um, and you know, something else that I wanted to ask was I study advertising right now, and a study that we actually talked about was how there is such thing called selective retention. And the way that they tested this actually was through advertisements or, you know, commercials or informative commercials about substance abuse. You know, sometimes you'll see them while watching TV or,
Right,
you know, any sort of advertisement, right?
right,
Um, and so after the study, they actually determined that those who were struggling with substance abuse did not seem to recall any sort of, you know, infomercial or substance abuse commercial, whereas people who have not been dealing with that seem to remember all of them and all the little details about the commercial and stuff like that. So it's kind of interesting to see how, you know, when somebody is in a certain state of mind, they really can
hmm
filter out what they want to hear and what they don't want to hear.
right.
And so you know, this was a loose study, and I wanted to know, you know, what is your opinion on that? Do you think that that is
Right.
something that is true?
Right, right. Well, I think it's partly selective attention, but I'd also encourage you. It's also partly neurological. In another book I wrote called "If You Work It, It Works: The Science Behind 12-Step Recovery." One of the chapters is about the brain functioning, and what research has found. This is very interesting. Is that about 50% of people who enter treatment for substance abuse have some kind of a cognitive deficit,
Mhm.
and that's related to their substance abuse. In other words, focusing, paying attention, remembering things, they actually have a deficit.
Really?
And over time, that deficit can heal. But when they enter treatment, you're talking about maybe half the people who have some kind of a problem with executive functioning, making decisions, remembering things, which is another reason why we need to pay attention to what happens after rehab.
Mhm.
And one reason that fellowships can be important, because you're talking about people who have trouble remembering things, or even, organizing things. And sometimes when you go to a fellowship, Women for Sobriety, it helps you focus on what you need to do.
Right.
Okay. And gives you time to heal. And so one of the reasons I think that somebody who's newly sober can watch something and not retain it could have to do with what they want to remember and what they want to see, but it also could be partly, based on neurological cognitive deficit that they experience at that point.
Yeah, definitely. And that is so interesting how it changes, you know, brain fog. I mean, that is so interesting, and definitely something that I think people need to understand as well. Um, so I enjoyed reading about recovery after rehab and how most importantly, it can have a significant impact on family members and loved ones. So what is the most crucial advice that you would give to somebody whose loved one is struggling with addiction?
Well, I think, to someone whose loved one is struggling with addiction,
Yeah,
I think the most important message is that you are a stakeholder in their recovery. So don't let anyone tell you that it's your loved one's problem and he or she has to solve it all by themselves. They obviously have responsibility for doing something about it, okay? And there's no doubt about that. And it's their addiction, so they have responsibility for recovery. But don't let anybody tell you stay out of it, it's not your problem, because you're a stakeholder.
right.
And so I think getting involved, understanding all these issues, maybe trying to work collaboratively with the newly sober person is the best way to see that recovery, is gonna take root, as you might say.
Yeah, definitely. And you know, with that being said, is there anything that you have to say for maybe society as a whole that we could take away from, you know, this book, or what is something that society as a whole could maybe do differently? I mean, if you have anything, that
Yeah, I definitely do, which I
yeah,
think was what motivated me to write the book, which is that as a society, we still tend to be too short-sighted about recovery
yeah,
from addiction. Like any chronic illness, diabetes, hypertension, these are chronic conditions. You can't just go to a doctor once who diagnoses you with hypertension, prescribes medication, and you never see him again. You know, that's not the way it works.
Right.
And that's not the way it works with addiction. We tended to be short-sighted, so we tend to think, okay, we send somebody for rehab and that's it. Society, we need to broaden our perspective and realize that these people are dealing with a chronic condition, and they're going to need ongoing support. So when they leave rehab, you know, I would hope that, you know, we could provide them with ongoing support for at least the whole next year.
Right.
You know, and including, you know, fellowships and family work. But we tend to be short-sighted, too short-sighted as a society right now, and tend to think that rehab or treatment is going to be the cure.
Right. Yeah. I mean, unfortunately, that is usually how it goes. You know, people lack the perspective that they haven't experienced or that they haven't been around. So definitely, I think that is super important. And I'm glad that you got a chance with your book to emphasize these points. So finally, in your book, you talk about creating a recovery lifestyle. I believe this is essential in having an effective long-term recovery from addiction. So what are the steps most important when changing your lifestyle?
Well, it begins, I try to begin with the book where what you're thinking when you leave rehab. Let's get honest with what you're really thinking. Some people will say, I need to stay sober. That's what they'll talk the talk. But what do you really believe? And there needs to be a dialogue between you and your loved ones. You know, do you really think that, 6 months now I can use again, you know? And you need to be aware of the research, because the research doesn't support that thinking. And then you need to step by step, you know, start to change your lifestyle. You may need some medication-assisted treatment. You know, you may need some medication to help you along the way, and that's fine. But you need to think about whether you want to stay on that medication like methadone for the rest of your life, or whether you want to use something like methadone as sort of a bridge while you're building a recovery lifestyle. And then step by step, you know, make those lifestyle changes, you know, that I talk about. And I guess maybe the last thing has to do with checking, you know, do you think you may have some history of mental illness that played a role in this? Or do you have a history of trauma that you've never really dealt with, that contributed to your substance use? And maybe you need to sort of add a mental health component to your recovery.
Definitely. Treat the issue and, you know, don't just treat the symptom type of situation there.
Right.
Well, you know, that's about it for me. Dr. Nowinski, I really appreciate you joining me today to talk about your experience. And I think, I mean, it's a great thing that you're doing. And I think it does need to be talked about more. So I really appreciate you being open with your experiences in your book.
You're very welcome. Great questions, by the way.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. All right. If that's all, that's it for me.
Take care.
Thanks so much. Have a good one. This is Hailey Hough for the Power of the Patient Project. Thank you.